there, Darryl. Good evening to you.
Good evening to you too, Alexis. How's it going?
Not too shabby, not too shabby. It was a beautiful day on Jeju.
Oh yeah,
Spring has sprung, as they like to say.
yeah. I wouldn't know. I was just inside the whole day. I never.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
Ooh.
I look out of my window. Go, ha! People are out there having a good time. And
Well, let
just
me ask you a
stay in my
question.
comfort
Outside
zone.
your window, can you at least see some cherry blossoms? Because it's season.
No, I cannot. But there's a whole row right by my house. It's
Oh,
not
that's
far,
nice. Have you taken the
right?
family out walking and got the obligatory snapshots?
Yeah, I don't. I'm not a big. I mean, yes, they're lovely. I'm not the
Here we
biggest.
go again with grumpy grumps
Yeah, I mean,
Darryl.
they're fine, right? Like they're lining the streets on Jungmoon, right? So
Right, right.
you know, and it attracts crowds and tourists, and that are just asking to be hit by cars. Have you noticed that?
You are such an old Graham. It's funny though. I was just driving down your street on Saturday evening. I was
Uh-huh.
down in your hood and was on that cherry blossom lined street, and it was raining in the city, but down in your end of the woods, it was perfectly amazing.
Yeah.
I stopped and took a million photos.
South side is rules. It's the preferred side of the island.
Do you want to get a T-shirt that says that? Southside
South
rules.
side rules. Yeah. Middle-aged man rapping.
Just to add to your Grampy Gramps version.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. No,
So,
I.
well, for our followers, our listeners on Instagram, I will definitely put up some photos of the cherry blossoms for any of
Uh-huh.
you past Jeju folks that miss it over here. I'll put some shots up on Insta and Facebook. We'll cross post.
So do you like skulk around the island looking for spots or something?
I do skulk around the island, but I actually also have my own secret spots
Uh-huh.
that I like to
And
go to.
and where, pray tell, these secret spots may be?
For sure, I'm not telling it on the podcast. For sure, I don't want a million people there. This is
Right.
how Wadlegate got ruined. People started putting it
Right.
in blog posts and telling
We
everyone
used to
the
go
location.
swimming there, and now, like in that little grotto area, and
Yep.
now it's a bunch of people taking pictures, just like the
Well,
cherry
what about
blossoms.
people still go swimming, but compared to like in 2012, 2014, when there was like maybe 8 people total,
Right.
now they bring tour buses in of tourists. So on any given hot summer day, you can have like 80 people there.
So where are some places that people could see them though, that you will let people know about?
I will let people know that they can go onto the Jeju National University Drive, because that
Right.
whole beautiful stretch going into the university is lined.
Uh-huh.
And then my second favorite is the Jeju Stadium right outside the city.
Yeah,
Is
right.
the dog going to say hi to us again?
Yeah, the dog. Yeah, the Jeju. Yeah, that's true. There are a couple quite nice spots on Jeju for cherry blossoms. I can't think of them at the moment, but definitely JNU.
Yep.
I used
and then
to.
the stadium.
They have like a. Isn't there like a cherry blossom festival most years? But
Yeah, so they
not
used
this
to
year.
have the festival at the stadium, and then they moved it down the road. So Jungmoon has the tourist street,
Right.
and then we have the stadium, and now the festival. Of course, not this year, but now the festival is right outside City Hall,
Uh-huh.
and I don't know the name of that street, unfortunately, but it's in between Tapdong and Sicheon.
Right. Isn't?
So good luck
Is it-
finding that, everybody.
Yeah, those are great.
Sure,
Solid
you can miss it, though.
directions.
You
Yeah.
can't miss it. Go down the road as if you're going to this ocean.
Mm.
Swivel your head left. If you see cherry blossoms, turn that way.
Aren't they by Yeongdeom too? Yeongdeom, the Dragon Head Rock.
Oh, that's probably true. Maybe. Well, now we're just
Maybe.
guessing. Let's not
Yeah.
put people on wild
Yeah,
goose
that's not
chase.
very helpful to people. They're on the island. Go see them if you're here.
Check them
Lots.
out. Check them out.
Yeah.
So I have to tell you, I also went last week. I went to the Fire Festival.
Oh, did you? You actually got tickets to that, huh?
I did, and listen, I had a lot of doubts because I was like, well, what should it be like?
Uh-huh.
Sorry, my camera's going out, and I was thinking, how's this gonna be? We're all gonna be sitting in the car.
Right.
This is gonna be ridiculous.
Uh-huh.
But you know what, Darryl? It
Yeah.
was absolutely amazing.
Oh, really?
They did such a good job with it. I
Mm.
once again, Korea slash Jeju, props for me for trying to make things as normal as it possibly can be, and that
Yeah.
was fantastic. I will say though,
Yeah.
I was in section A and I was in the first row in my car, so we had an unobscured view of the mountain going up on
Oh,
fire.
well, I've seen pictures from it. Like Yun Hap had pictures of it, and it looks really cool to see the reflections of the fire and the fireworks off the hoods and
Off the cars,
yeah,
right?
it's really neat.
Yeah, it was really amazing. I also saw a few pictures of the car, the back shot with all the cars lined
Right.
up in the fire. It was really cool.
But what was going on? Like, what was actually there other than like I saw a video of the fireworks and stuff, which is cool, and the COVID get out. But like,
Right.
what else? Like, was there anything else?
Well, I'll tell you this: if you saw the video for our listeners, I will post on Facebook a YouTube link that the government provided so that everyone
Mm.
can see and you can see what was going on. So they had set up a stage as usual right under the autumn, and it had all the performances like they would every year,
Right.
except there was no audience. We were just in our cars, and they piped the music in, and you could also turn on the radio station and
Oh,
listen to the
cool.
music. So, however, I was in the front row of section A, so
Uh-huh.
the speaker was right there and the mountain was right there. So it was really, really just again, good job, Jeju.
How long was it? Like the length of the event? I saw
Oh,
the fireworks was like 8 minutes or something like that, which is
yeah,
cool.
yeah, yeah. The actual
Yeah.
the actual mountain and the fireworks were
Oh.
over real quick, but I was a little anxious I think it's gonna be my last one on Jeju. So I was anxious to get there. So I grabbed my girlfriends and we got there pretty early. I'd say we got there by 5 o'clock to get the front row.
Uh-huh.
And then we just snacked and chatted and
I thought you
listened
weren't
to
allowed to eat in your car.
Yeah, but you could leave your car. You had to turn on your hazards to get escorted to the bathroom.
Right. That's a very
No
dignified
complaints for me.
symbol. Uh-huh.
Yeah, no complaints. We had the best time.
Oh, that's
My
great.
girlfriends that went with me had the best time. We were really, really. It was a great, great, great event.
Oh, perfect. That sounds like a blast. I kind of wish I went. Kind of wish I went now.
No, you don't,
Yeah.
grumpy cramps.
Okay, so I guess that's now time for our second segment
Jeju
of
Dialect.
Jeju Dialect Corner. Okay, with our teacher Hyunjung. All right, so it's time for another segment of Jeju Dialect Corner, brought to you by GS25 in Jungmun, across the street from the Uche-guk. When
The place to get all your tasty treats.
all your tasty treats and beverages and libations. When in Jungmun, make sure to hit up the GS25 by the bus station across from the post office. Now, with us is my lovely dog, for those who can see, and our wonderful sensei Nim Hyunjung. Hello, thank you for being here again by choice, obviously.
Hi,
No,
Hyunjung.
Hi.
Hi. Nice to see you.
Yeah, nice to see you too.
So I gotta tell you, the last word we did, little bit hard for me to do.
Mhm.
So I'm looking forward to this segment and seeing how much better my Jeju dialect improves.
Okay, so yeah, so what one more time, what did we do last time? Miran goran shini.
Actually, last time we learned, 머랭 고람시니.
Mm-hmm.
That means, what are you saying?
Right.
That's the name of this section, right?
Yes. As a placeholder. And now what are we learning today?
Today, you guys asked,
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
so hello in
Uh-huh.
Jeju-do Saturi,
Uh-huh.
Jeju dialect. Actually, I had to think about hello in Jeju-do dialect. Because
Oh,
I don't
really?
think not really we say hello.
Mm-hmm.
So I had to call my dad to ask what's in Jeju Saturi, and he said we don't say hello when we meet people, not really.
Mm-hmm.
Instead, my father said 어디로 감수강.
Oh, yeah, that's much easier.
Yeah, 어디로 감수강. That means where are you going. That's usually
Oh.
they use instead of say hello.
Yeah.
So
one more
you're
time.
passing someone on the street and you're not gonna say hi. You're gonna be like, so where are you going today?
Yes.
Oh,
That's the
fascinating. Okay.
yeah.
So how do you say it one more time?
어디로 감수강.
Ode?
어대로 감수강.
Kamsugan is the Jeju dialect part, right? Odero.
Yeah.
O is oda, which means to come.
Yeah,
or to
but
go.
also like 어대로 is like 아니 어들의 감수강.
Odero Gamsugan.
어들의 감수강.
Odero Gamsugan. Okay, you try, Alexis. Go.
No. You know what? I have learned what I need is I need the phonetic spelling like in front of my face because I just can't do it. It is so embarrassing.
드,
The,
레,
de,
레,
Ne. As
Ne.
in-
감,
hum,
수,
su,
강.
gung.
Yeah.
Okay, so why don't we try the easier, the one that will probably come more often, which is how do you say thank you in Jeju Satori?
Ooh, that's excellent.
Yeah. We say 고맙습니다.
Komapsuda.
고맙습니다. 예. 고맙습니다.
And what is
고맙습니다.
it
예.
typically in Korean?
고맙습니다.
감사합니다.
Right. And so then say
yeah.
again in Jeju.
고맙습니다. 고맙습니다. 예.
Oh, so the ending dae.
Yeah. Yes.
You can do that. I usually just say komapsuda. And people, and if you say this to our listeners,
People love
say,
you.
Yeah, say this when you go shopping to your favorite, like, Odang place, you'll get extra food. They love it. You get huge Jeju-do street cred from the South Side, if you say kumapsuda.
Actually, like I remember, like it's almost like 10 years ago when we lived in Seoul, and Darryl used to say like 고맙습니다 all the time. So like he thought we are still on Jeju Island.
People would
And
correct
like,
me.
yeah, and like at the like a convenience store, like he said like 고맙습니다, and then like people in Seoul like what? Like they were like looking at him like weirdly.
Yeah. Or sometimes on the island, if I say that, I did say that before, people would correct me. So today's words again are
어디로 감수강? 어디래 감수강?
and
고맙습니다.
선생님, 현정, 고맙습니다.
No.
Thank you. No?
You learned.
Yeah, 고맙습니다. Thank you very much.
You,
And
teacher.
that'll do another segment of 뭐라고? Our Jeju Satori Dialect Corner, brought to you by GS25 in Jungmun. When in Jungmun, hit up GS25. And yeah, so that was another segment of the Jeju Dialect Corner. I hope your Satori is coming along nicely there, Alexis.
Well, mine not so much. I have to wait just like our listeners, and I need to wait for the phonetic spelling that you print up on the thing. So for our listeners, please do come to our Instagram pages, our Facebook page. We will put the Jeju dialect on there so you can listen and read at the same time, which is the way my brain works.
So now we're running kind of a little bit out of time here, so we might have to muscle through some stuff.
Absolutely, let's do it.
Is kind of important. So what happened in the last little while that didn't actually get a lot of immediate attention, unfortunately, is the fact that on Jeju, the largest ever court case was held on March 16th, involving 333 defendants. It's the largest. Yeah, and the
Is
defendant...
that the largest for Jeju ever, or just about this specific trial?
Largest in Korea ever.
Oh my gosh!
It's the most defendants. Yeah, because... And it has to do with, of course, Sam, the Jeju 4-3, the Jeju 4-3 massacre, because the 333 defendants were cleared of their, insurrection charges, which, and it's huge.
So
it's
this was
a huge
complete
day.
dismissal of charges.
Yeah. They had 21 sessions from 10 a.m. to 6 a.m. in blocks, right? So 21 sessions, there was 10 or whatever defendants tried on that. Most of them aren't living anymore, right? There was family members
doing
and
it
things like
for
that.
their names.
Yeah, to get them expunged because it's still a criminal record, and those criminal records followed them, prevented them from getting work, prevented their family from getting work, and
it was just a stain on their name.
Yeah. But this is the culmination of years of work by the Jeju 4-3 People Solidarity Organization, which
Right.
started like doing research on those convicted in court martials, right? These were two court martials where in 1948 and 1949, where 2,530 people were convicted in mass, right? Like at the same time. 350 people, 305 people were given life imprisonment. 384 people were executed. That's
Jeez.
what those bodies, I believe, at the airport are.
Okay.
Right, because that was one of the court-martial sites.
Jeez. Wow.
Right. So when you, like I said before, when you land on tarmac, you're landing on the bodies of
people.
awful the awful history here, you know, and it's like it's not vindictive, it's vindicating for them, right, and their families.
That's an important word to make sure you get right. It's vindicating for these families, absolutely.
Right, yeah, because it was a scarlet letter, for lack of a better term. It was something that haunted them.
Right.
You know, people left the island because of it, because of the war.
You at the beginning you said you mentioned very quickly, you said it doesn't seem to have gotten a lot of coverage, media coverage. Do you have any opinions on why that is? Because I think you're right. Nobody's talking about it. I haven't seen it pop up in you know, my Korean threads and things like that.
You know, we'll probably get into a little bit of this later when we talk to our guest who's coming on, Brendan Wright, but
it's
also
a curious thing.
Jeju doesn't get a lot of attention normally. Right? That's why it's really important when the president came to the 4-3 event, because the president always gets coverage, right?
Exactly. That's exactly right.
So when the president comes, then people pay attention. And I don't really know why. Maybe because it's still so political. Maybe because it's complicated, right? Like you want to get to the next, like the nit and gritty about these charges and the fact that there was no, like, they couldn't find evidence about them. It's a little bit more complicated than just a simple story, right? So maybe that's why.
And not even just this court case is complicated, but the whole issue is complicated. I mean, we've talked about this in previous episodes. I believe scholars spend lifetimes uncovering and discussing and, you know, the whole 4-3. And I think we'll go into this later about how 4-3 led up to other things.
Right.
So, I mean, this is people's whole realm of study can just be about this one subject. So it's a lot. It's a lot to take in.
And you know, I just, like, when I heard it, I just took a moment to just think about the people that I had interviewed who are convicted in these court martials, right? Like, there was this one woman who was a 16-year-old Henyo who, she had put her name down on a list that she thought was to go to the mainland for work during the early days of the massacre. And what it was a list of, like, communist registry. And somebody found the registry. And the police did, not somebody. The police found the registry, saw her name on it, and she was convicted to 10 months in prison. But it wasn't so much the 10 months that was the problem. It was the fact that, like, she couldn't get married, she couldn't get a job that affected her children, you know? And most of the people who were convicted were sent to the mainland, right? With these longer sentences, and which they had to live out. Like, one guy I spoke to was arrested on the mainland and then was released when the Korean War happened. I think he may have been released by North Koreans that were advancing. But then after the Korean War, he had to go back to jail to finish the rest of his sentence.
They let him out to fight, and then he had to go back and serve his sentence.
Yeah, I don't think he fought, actually. I think they let him out, and he just, like, you stay here, you're going to be killed. So go.
Oh, so a mercy release.
I suppose so, yeah.
Good. See, and this is what I mean when you say it's little details like that. They're never ending. Like, I had never heard a story like that. But Darryl, do tell me, let's go back, and what happened to the Henyo woman? Did you interview her recently?
I interviewed her back in 2019. She was exonerated.
Is she here now on Jeju? Or?
Yeah. So the people that I mentioned, I interviewed back in 2019. They were the first people to be exonerated during the court cases back then.
Those first cases,
then.
okay.
Yeah. And they were the ones that were awarded $4.4 million, a combined $4.4 million US dollars.
Divided amongst those certain amount of people.
The 18
I remember
people.
that. I remember that was huge news on Jeju. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, so these are the people that I'm referring to now that I spoke to. Then I actually plan to interview them again, or at least some of them again shortly, because
Yeah,
for
to
my
see
project
what
that I'm working on, but also to make sure that we have their information, their
and their
stories.
voices keep giving them a chance to. They haven't had all these chances to be heard and have their voices heard. So any sort of opportunity, if they're willing, seems like a good thing for this country and a good thing for Jeju.
Yeah, well, I was interviewing a woman on the weekend on Sunday for like 3 hours. And
Okay.
yeah, and I asked her, like, are you okay talking about this for so long? Like, do you want to? And
Right.
she was more than happy to, because she said it's a good way to kill time. But she also said, like,
Fair enough.
I can finally talk about this now because they couldn't talk about it until
Right.
2000.
It must be such a
So,
release. So Darryl, so that first batch was given a monetary reward,
yeah.
and we talked about this a little bit last week, our last podcast, I mean.
Mm.
So has there been any more news about this latest bunch of 300 and
No.
some people? Has there been any news about a monetary
About
not
reparations?
reward? Oh yeah, yeah. Sorry, that's a much better word. Apologies.
I'm not sure what's going to happen with that because that's also
Okay.
involved in the special act that passed
Okay.
that we talked
Okay.
about. So the reparations might be part of that.
Okay.
The people that I spoke to went to court seeking the reparations.
Right, of
Right.
course.
So this, if it's in the law, they may not have to, because the law does address like the people who were wrongly convicted in the courts martial.
So you're saying perhaps that this new law is going to clear everybody's name, but perhaps there won't be a money attachment to it.
No, I'm saying that the new law might have a monetary attachment
And
for
but
it
it's
because
just
it does
not
mention
known.
reparations.
They're not advertising it right now, basically.
It's one of these laws that's going to take a long time. Like they need to like set aside a budget for that kind of stuff. They need to get
it out. Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
but it opens the avenue for that to happen, right?
Huge
so it's going to
news
be
for Jeju.
yeah,
Huge
really
news.
big news, good news.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and that leads into April 3rd is coming up. So
Right.
the anniversary, not the anniversary, the memorial, the anniversary, whatever you want to call it. So that's going to be a big news. Maybe the president will come. We usually find out later.
Yeah, I'm sure they don't advertise that so much in advance. Well, and of course, this year with COVID, there's certainly whoever is invited. It's certainly going to be a well-spaced event and probably not like previous years.
Well, and because of these two events, it's actually going to, I imagine, get a little bit more attention, especially because of the law that passed, right?
So.
And so people are going to talk about that, give speeches. Then hopefully it'll give more time. But we're going to speak with a Jeju. Well, not even a Jeju scholar, a Korea scholar that has studied the Jeju Massacre and talk to him more about the importance of what happened here.
I think that's going to be really interesting, and I believe, we'll see what happens. I think we're probably going to get some broader history that's not just about Jeju, but leads into other things. So that'll be really interesting. So everyone, stay tuned.
So, following our March 1st shooting episode podcast, I got a message from a Canadian scholar, Brendan Wright, concerning some of the things that I may have glossed over slightly in my summarization of trying to come up with a shorthand of what they were protesting that day on March 1st, 1947. So I thought, why not invite him onto the podcast and get into a little bit more about the history of what or how 4/3 Jeju Massacre happened. So thank you for coming onto the podcast, Brendan.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Nice to see you, Brendan. Thank you.
Yeah, nice to see you.
I should mention that Brendan's a lecturer at St. Mary's University, and he does research on anti-left massacres during the Korean War with a framing work of memory politics of these massacres. Is that a good way to summarize it?
Yeah, I would say mass violence and memory politics. Because, I kind of do a bit of both, yeah.
Oh, perfect. So I guess let's get at it and say, what are some of the factors that led to the March 1st shooting incident where 6 people were killed and 8 were injured that kind of went to the beginning of the massacre?
Yeah, right. So just to give I sort of brought it on myself to come onto this podcast by challenging some of what you claimed. So I just want to say, first of all, to yourself and your viewer, I actually really liked your discussion of it, and I actually learned some things I didn't know, which is not always the case, especially at the hospital. But to give people some background, I took a little umbrage with the idea that they were protesting the division of Yeah. Now, I think some of it's tricky because there's the March 1st incident, then there's what's called the 4-3 uprisings. By the time of the 4-3 uprisings, the position was, or at least one of the official reasons was, opposing the separate elections in the South. And some of this was indeed, we could say, a kind of national resistance or a way to prevent the division of Korea. But the other side of the coin is that the unification elections were going to be a very bad thing for the local left. So some of this was to prevent the further erosion of their position in Jeju's politics. Now, about the March 1st uprisings, now, or the protests, it gets a little complicated because there's what the people of Jeju were protesting, and then there's how they were organized. And we don't know where one begins and where one ends. So at least the primary groups who organized the protest and led the speeches were tied to the Jeju left and the Workers' Party and the People's Committees. And you can see from their speeches, they were demanding, among other things, the resurrection of the People's Committees because Jeju had lost a lot of its sovereignty with the integration of the province into the mainland. And with that was also a shift in political power to the right, who were more aligned with the central government, and a decline of the local left power. So that's the political context, but also in their speeches, they're asking, for example, for the withdrawal of the arrest warrant for Park Han-young, who was the leader of the South Korean Workers' Party. So quite clearly there is a kind of what we could see as a left-wing tone to these protests. Now, as far as the people in Jeju protesting, there was a lot of things happening. With that process, there was an increased tax burden on the population. There was a massive increase in police, including police from the mainland. There was loss of local autonomy from many village elders who were respected. So these things are not what we could consider to be properly ideological in left-right terms.
So like two different situations coming together to form one, basically.
Yeah, or part of a process that we can see from different angles. Like one being, definitely political leaders fighting over control of things, but then, the society being engulfed in this. And there's an ideological context, and then there's an institutional context to it.
Yeah. And do you think that politics? Do you think the Jeju people were being led a certain way?
It's hard for me to tell because we don't quite know what there is going on in their consciousness. The position of the Americans at the time, who were quite just chauvinistic and bigoted about this, was that the Jeju people were ignorant and didn't know better, and then were susceptible to the extreme right and the extreme left and didn't know what was good for them. But I think a lot of it has to do with the actual structure, and this was true more so in Jeju, but true of a lot of Korea, where a lot of actually authority was in local village leaders like the Myeonjang or some of the thought leaders who were tied to these communities. So we have to get into that level, and I haven't done a lot of research on what was going on at that level, but I don't think it's a layered structure, and I don't think it's the case where they're ideological, but they're not apolitical.
I got you.
It's interesting that you mentioned about the Americans, right? Because part of the reason why the left had such a strong hold on Jeju was because following liberation, the Workers' Party was essentially the de facto government on Jeju for like an entire year. So when they banned the party from functioning, they had already been the government. So my question is that the bigoted stance of the Americans is kind of why they didn't have a government on Jeju for an entire year beforehand? Is that something that allowed that to happen? The vacuum?
I don't think it's quite the bigoted sense. I think a lot of the vacuum just had to do with where it was in terms of its political geography and just its rank of importance. Like, it's an isolated island from the mainland. The way the Americans worked out in terms of how they overtook and dismantled the autonomous powers of the People's Committees or the kind of Korea People's Republic was they branched out in Seoul and then moved out into the areas, right? And then it's telling that the big uprisings happened furthest away from the capital, first in and around Daegu in 46, and then in Jeju, because these periods had the longest period of people's committees gestation and autonomy. So it could be. I don't think it's the first priority was kind of like an act of bigotry towards Jeju.
Right.
It's just in terms of imperial geography, this is just not that important.
That's a good point. Americans didn't get here for a couple months anyways. Like before Jeju, it took them a while to get here, I believe.
Right, yeah, and they saw it as, looking at the documents, there's different ways of looking at it, because one is, that iconic image where they're showing taking down the Japanese flag and putting up the American flag, so it's quite imperial, but then the other side of it, it's broadly a hands-off imperialism at the first time, at least from an administrative perspective, and the Americans just saw the People's Committee as kind of benign.
There's this piece of research that I've been sitting on, and I don't know what to do with it. Is the fact that when I found out that some of the Americans that were on Jeju, their families were here with them.
Oh, right? Wow, that's fascinating. Yeah, you're probably more knowledgeable about the American context than I am, and I'd be interested to learn more about that. So they're where are they based in Jeju? In the city, or?
Yeah, well, Gwendokjeong, right? They had close to where the March 1st shooting incident happened, right? But it's like when you look at some of the files and some of the declassified transcripts and whatnot, there's a lot of corruption, but it's not this like corruption that you always necessarily think of, right? Like it's like cronyism and doing things for people that can do things for them on the island and this kind of stuff that angered
the American way.
Yeah, kind of, I suppose so. As a Canadian, maybe I shouldn't comment on that.
I can say that because I'm American.
But it's just in like my interest is always on the personal, the actual histories, because I get bogged down when we talk about Americanism, when we talk about the bigger political stuff, and I can actually hold on to the fact that one of the daughters of one of the Americans learned to drive on Jeju, right? Like this is where she got her driving experience during the massacre, which is just floors me that kind of stuff happened. So, continuing on what we were talking about, one of the things that you did mention to me in the message is that Jeju is often overlooked for the nationalist credentials, like I said, concerning the division, and I agree with that. But why do you think that is?
So what you mean? Why has kind of nationalism overtaken some of these more ideological and political elements in terms of the dominant representations?
Right. Well, why does it become like the nationalist push for like fighting against the division of Korea become what it seems to overshadow the entire event massacre?
Right. Yeah, so I think that's a really complicated history, but to just think about some of the fast things. One is, of course, just the stigma of leftism. Many people were murdered as communists, but that didn't end, of course, after Jeju 4-3. There was the Yunjuaje, like the guilt by association system, where people were surveilled, denied entrance into government positions, denied visas. And these are just the overt. There's the whole psychological context to that. So there's to achieve any kind of recognition as victims, they have to negotiate with this stigma of leftism. So, now, so I think that's why there's always this reluctance to kind of deal directly with the ideological context. Looking at it more locally, the other thing is like, this is tricky, right? Because there's elements to the Jeju 4-3, but one of them is partially a civil war with the people of Jeju amongst themselves. This is to ignore the element of the mainland rightist invasion, which I think is more foundational.
It's a big part,
the,
right?
Scale of violence, and I'm of the position that the state is responsible for the massacre. But there was also leftist violence against rightists and other just opportunistic or revenge killings. So I think when the process of reconciliation happened, it wasn't just about honor restitution of leftists. It's also in some ways about reconciling this history of civil war violence. So I think downplaying the ideological context and instead playing on victimhood is useful. At the same time, I think it's still a political story, right? So you can't just work with this kind of narrative of victims. There needs to be something else there. And there were concrete nationalist appeals to the left, right? It's not like these are mutually exclusive, and it's the same with the right wing as well. Like what's going on in Korea are competing nationalisms, among other things. So it's that's kind of a long explanation, but I think it's still like getting with it's a long and general explanation. So I think it's the stigma of leftism, but also still trying to recover this politicization. And one thing to think about with the name is I recently got a note from a scholar. It was actually in a review for an article I wrote, so I don't know who said this, but they actually told me that now the Samsa Sagon name is falling out of favor. And instead they mentioned that it's now back to, and I'll find the exact name there, but the English translation is the People's Protest in Korean Unification.
I have never heard that before.
Yeah, so this could have been from a left scholar who was saying this, but this is very similar to the 80s kind of Minjung movement, where it's the Hangjang struggle and the uprising, but they've added this Korean unification to the kind of struggle. So these things are still ongoing, and I would have to look into this because I saw this very recently that now there's a push.
I don't know if that's true, to be honest with you, because I talk to a lot of scholars and deal with their work here, and I've never seen it referred to that. But it's
I've seen it referred to that, but I don't know in any kind of official formal context.
No, this goes to like one of the lines that you wrote in one of your works is that there's a profound ambivalence as to how to properly define the event, right? And I spent a lot of my time talking to people before, trying to like going into the different political aspects of the different names and so forth. But why do you think, what do you mean, and why do you think there's been a profound ambivalence about properly defining it?
Yeah, I think it has to do again with the kind of political history of it, where first it was written off as this riot, and then
dismissive,
and then after kind of a claim of the uprising narrative as pushback, and then now into this Sakon, which is just like, it's in some ways it's safer to be very ambivalent in your official explanations, and it's more inclusive, right? That's also, I think, very important for the local healing, and I think what's going on broadly. Yeah, and more broadly, I think what's going on, and this has always been the case, but through this, there's also just the production and reproduction of local identity. And this incident has been elevated, right? I'm sure you're aware of this living on Jeju. This is now part of, I don't like this term. I don't love it, but I'm going to use it. Part of the imagined community of Jejuers is shared history of suffering and grief and resistance.
This is true, yeah.
But I hear a lot about reconciliation when it comes to this event, right? And it sometimes feels like what they mean by reconciliation, and I think it's Ta-Nehisi Coates who says that the term reconciliation often means with the concretization of history, right? And it kind of feels like they're, I the best way to say it is that when somebody talked about nominating the island of Jeju for the Nobel Peace Prize, they keep saying that they got over the event. It's over with. They reconciled. But it's not the case when you talk to survivors, right? In some ways. Like they talk about, I can point to the houses where families of murderers still live, right? Like and so I think that ambivalence is a good way to put it, because it's such a fraught and political minefield of a situation, right?
But there's just so much information.
Right. And I think now there's because of just the timing, it is now almost officially moving into kind of post-memory where there are very few witnesses or survivors. I don't think these calls for the history being closed really will come into fruition, just because of the way any traumatic history ends. So I think you're right to be kind of wary of that, but I also think they'll, just because of the enormity of it and what we don't know, I think there'll continue to be contestations about it at all kinds of levels. But when we're thinking about some of the work I do, which principally looks at at least the stuff you've looked at is more state sanctioned, or at least stuff that runs through the state and is supposed to be official, then there's a bit more of an effort to make it concrete and official, right, and try to find a consensus. So some of this is also just part of the bureaucratization of history that we see happen every that word, but you know what I mean. Like, you have multiple competing actors here, and there has to be some kind of consensus or frame. I actually think it's quite it's not my place to say what I like or don't like, but I do think the idea of the Sakon as open-ended and unknown and ambivalent, I think is actually appropriate at that level.
Right. And so one of the things that you have written about is you talk about it being a part of a larger and broader campaign of violent political cleansing. What other aspects? So you kind of put it in a larger context. What other? Can you explain a little bit about these connections to other atrocities that you're referring to?
Yeah, right. And I'll try to do it without reciting my whole dissertation. It's really challenging.
Good luck.
Right. So we talked a little bit about the political history of left-right struggle, and just to frame Jeju a little, the way I see it is I actually see it very much as less of an uprising, like the uprising's there, but I think actually the dominant engine driving this is the right-wing consolidation and takeover of the state, which is happening both in Jeju and at the national level through the establishment of separate elections, and the American help. So in the case of Jeju, the re-government in some ways saw this as a test to their legitimacy and authority, both as a state but also as a Cold War state, as part of the American bulwark. And there's this effort to make an example of Jeju, almost as a kind of sacrifice to show the Americans how good they are at preventing communists and massacring them.
Interesting.
But in terms of these other massacres, well, of course, while this is going on, the Yosun uprisings happen in the south, and many of the same counterinsurgency methods that are used on Jeju get imported onto the mainland. And a lot of the legal structures that are in place for creating boundaries of citizen and non-citizen, giving paramilitary groups the powers of summary execution, all these things get embedded into the state through this process of civil war and mass violence. And then when the North invade, then there's a broader effort or a project, I guess, of wiping out all the leftists. So I see it as a continuum, in other words, of state construction and ideological consolidation, and also a kind of counterinsurgency that in some ways is also creating the boundaries of who is and isn't a citizen of the South Korean state. Right, through this process of civil war violence. So I see these events as all interconnected. I hope I didn't lose you or anyone with that.
No.
Right. It's really
interesting to think of it that way. right? Like I'm trying to when I start thinking of it in a larger context, like it's not just because the way that we hear about it, it's so singular, right? Like it's separate.
Yeah.
It's its own thing, and it doesn't really connect to anything else, really, any of the other histories.
Yeah,
right?
I think so when I've spoken to activists about this, and you can see this at the museum, some of this stuff is adjacent to it. Like there's a separate little section on Yasun, and there's a certain sense of shared solidarity and suffering. But it's kind of ephemeral in some ways, or at least as a side, just for supplementing the idea of the localized atrocity. And I think in terms of collective memory or things, this stuff it makes sense. So when I critique it or put it into this broader frame, there's no real claim at my end about what should or shouldn't be done in the realm of memory. But now, of course, one of the interesting things about Jeju, and this is great, is it has a lot of research institutes and information and documentation, and it's somewhat asymmetric in relationship to what's happened on the mainland, where the restitution and truth process has been a lot more curtailed. So at this point now, it's kind of like the Jeju 4-3 has sort of superseded it, even at the national level, for the kind of anti-leftist violence.
Oh, that's interesting. I didn't really know that.
In the counterinsurgency. I mean, that's a general claim, right? But some of this comes down to the local aspect as well. So, for example, the National Guidance League killings. I don't love doing the numbers game, but there are credible work and evidence to suggest that the National Guidance League killings dwarfed the Jeju killings in terms of numbers. Like Kim Dong-chun, for example, has said it could be at least 100,000. And I've looked at the numbers, and it just seems to have happened on a massive scale across all of South Korea. But it's not seen as a local event or a provincial event because it just happens at the village level, and almost every village or every county basically south of Seoul is touched by this event where leftists got wiped out over 3 months. But that doesn't have the same kind of purchase in national or local memory, I think, for local reasons, and also because in the case of the National Guidance League killings, for those who are unfamiliar, these are officially confessed leftists. That history is complicated in itself, but yeah, so...
That's fascinating. I'm not familiar with that very much.
Yeah.
Sorry, I know.
Interesting.
No. On tangents, but yeah, it's hard to wrap your head around the kind of broader anti-left killings and what is and isn't local.
It's I did like reading your work for that and starting to think of it in that larger context, which in Korea, and it makes it kind of interesting when Korea actually spends quite a bit of time trying to connect it with other atrocities. Like, you've been to the park. They have the Berlin Wall there. They have they compare it to genocides, and some people argue that it is a genocide, right? So it's interesting that they go out of their way to it's not a judgment or anything, but there is an attempt to try to connect it internationally as opposed to locally. Is that more just a way to try to get
attention?
to get the word out, Jeju's trying to globalize it in a lot of ways. Like, they're trying to get people to know it.
I think that's part of it, right? And you can think about the audience, and I can't, from these texts, I can't necessarily read into what the intentionality is all the time. But I definitely think this general issue of the problem of leftism in the memory of the Korean Civil War is unresolved and is still fraught. So this, now I won't say this in the case of the people of Jeju or the readers, but when I've done some of my work traveling to different massacre sites, talking to some of the Ujokwe or the bereaved family associations, and it changes from group to group. But a common thing that I'll come across is this idea that the wrong people were massacred or the wrong people were repressed, and very few people who were killed as leftists in the memory were actually leftists. And that's probably true in a lot of cases, but there's still this huge stigma about that political history, which I entirely understand from a perspective of people who have been repressed and stigmatized and basically gaslit about this history for so long. But in terms of the problem of national memory, and this goes back to the issue of the People's Committees and the People's Republic, one of the great what-ifs of post-liberation Korea is part of this politicide and this massacre. I think this point's very important, was the wiping out of a different idea of Korea that had potentially, in some ways, not just left, but also more autonomous government, things like early land reforms, all these ideas that were progressive got annihilated in this period.
Just shut down completely, hey?
Yeah, well, in a complex way, right? But the kind of straw on that was, the massacre of the leftists. And in the North, it's a different history.
So your work focuses on, and tell me if I'm wrong, on like the politics of memory. Is that correct?
Yeah.
And can you explain a little bit what that means? Because I'm not sure if a lot of people understand what politics of memory. Is that a huge?
I definitely. Hit me, Brandon. Hit me with some information.
Oh, sorry. It's just interesting because I've been in the process right now. I'm still advertised myself as a politics of memory scholar, but some people have said actually looking at my work, it's not really about memory because it's a continued political development because I look into the 60s. But I mean, to answer your question, politics of memory are just the kind of contestations about how an event in the past is remembered or forgotten, and who has the power or right to make purchase on that. So looking at, in this case, in our case, like how at least first the anti-communist right got to dominate the memory, and then now there's been pushback. So that's what I refer to as the politics of memory, just trying to deal with this traumatic past.
And that's
like
what
important work, like just based on what you're saying. Obviously, you two are much more educated on the subject, but just that phrase right there, politics of memory, seems like an important thing to define to really understand what all happened. Because if you don't understand this piece, because a lot of information you're telling me is new, so if you don't understand this piece, you're not going to understand the full package, the full.
Right.
I don't know the right word to say there, but
Yeah, and I should just say quickly, when I set out to do this work in the late 2000, the aughts, I guess we call them, I was going to be looking at contested memory, period. And then as I got into my research, more and more of it actually became about this unacknowledged history of organized and systemic mass violence, and this kind of untold story of a broad campaign to wipe out groups. So you have to dig into the concrete history of that to understand how the politics play out after.
It's interesting. How did you get into becoming a Korean scholar?
Yeah, I refer to myself as an accidental Koreanist. I kind of stumbled into it. In my MA, I was doing the Vietnam War, and I just started to see a lot of references to Korea there, and I became interested in the production of the past, and at the time, an interest. I was a Cold War scholar, an international relations scholar, and I got very frustrated with reading texts where, like, there was a short paragraph that said, 100,000 people were killed and nothing else. And I was like, whoa, I started to really hit on me just how violent this period of world history was and how little was discussed. And at this time, I became aware of the Korean War. I became aware of what was going on with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Korea. And originally I was going to look at U.S. massacres, like Nogonni, which you're probably familiar with, or some of the bombings of South Korean citizens that happened. But then as things progressed, I became more interested in this story.
Yeah.
It's fascinating. So that's why you like to write about the 1960-61 period, because that has a lot to do with memory of trying to figure out what happened.
Yeah, in the 60-61 period, I think there has been so few analyses of that period and what the bereaved families did. And just to give yourselves and the readers, or not the readers, the viewers or listeners, can tell I'm a writer.
Yeah.
A sense of what happened, of course, after the 419, protests or revolution, whatever you want to call it. There was, in that period of the Second Republic, actually petitions from bereaved families to have investigations and the right to mourn their loved ones over these massacres. This happened in Jeju, but it also happened in Gyeongsang and Cholla. And I'm somewhat familiar with the story of Gyeongsang and Cholla. And
Brendan, can I ask you a question real quick? When you say you're saying to publicly mourn, the right to publicly acknowledge, or what do you mean by that?
Yeah, and even the right, I should say, even in some cases, the right to privately mourn, because the state actually prevented access from the victims to the bodies. Some of these bodies have been desecrated by being burned, but weren't allowed to even access the graves, and the whole complicated nature of mourning in Korea. And when I did my research, I actually found that the main issue for families was that they were being haunted by their loved ones, because of this idea of kind of a begrudged spirit. So there was also a very visceral, intimate reason for this, to get rights to perform proper mortuary services. And I think the public aspect also was a political act, I think, to challenge what the state had said about this history, right? And 60-61, I think, is interesting because this is still all the survivors, and this history is still quite raw. And the big question mark for me is what happens in the village level after the massacres, and between this 60-61 period. We still don't quite know a lot about it during these, decade or so. But the Pak junta, when they overthrew the Second Republic, ordered the mass arrest of much of the bereaved family associations, jailed them, tortured some of their leaders, but also, I think, most grimly destroyed the monuments to the victims, in some ways desecrated their graves. So you can see a continuation. Is this politicidal logic where it's kind of right down to the level of the graves.
It didn't end just with a kill. It just was on and on.
Right. Yeah. Precisely. That's what happened in 60-61 very briefly.
That's really interesting.
Yeah, I'm only familiar with that a little bit because of Kim Hun-jun, who wrote The Massacres at Mount Hala. He's done a lot of work about the the reconciliation committees and things like that. I think that's his interest. And I remember he referred to the 60-61, this very short, 1 year period where there was democracy, no dictator before Park came into play, as a mad dash to, they started on Jeju at least. They started an investigation into the massacre, right? Yeah. So, and that was put to stop the second Park went into power.
Yeah, right, exactly.
Interesting.
And there's different ways too in the politics of memory about how to see that event. And again, the conflicts over leftism in that national memory are very complicated because the National Bereaved Family Association was led by ex-members of the Bodo Youngmang, who had been members of the Namnodong, the South Korean Workers' Party, and that was the justification for their repression, was that they were leftist. So in a lot of the I think this is true of Dr. Kim's work as well, but a lot of the studies I found is kind of they were just looking for the truth about what's happened, but it's actually there's the politics of that era are very complicated, and I've seen a lot of kind of leftist critiques of the state start to reemerge in the 60s. Jeju's a bit different, though. I see a stronger push on this reconciliation being tied to the promises of the 419 revolution and democratization, and the membership involved in there were, I think, less tied to anything that could be considered leftist politics.
Okay, great. I think that's about all the time we have. We've gone over. That was really interesting.
Sorry, I ramble and go on, but
no need to apologize. I wanted to hear
Please.
it. Yeah, I let it. It was fascinating. Thank you so much for agreeing to come on, and we'll have you on again if you're willing to join us at another time.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thanks for having me too.
And that was Brendan Wright schooling us, and that was a lot to take in, I got to tell you.
That was very impressive. I've said it quite a few times before. The ability for people to retain such information just blows my mind. That was really educational. Almost at some point too educational for me, because it was just so much information. It was really impressive.
I think this is why I focus mainly on like people and people's stories and histories, because it's so hard to understand the politics, and it's just
grasp it. Yeah. But
it's malleable, right?
Someone needs to do it, and he seems to be doing it really well.
Yeah.
So good job, Brendan.
Yeah, and so until next time, I'm Darryl. She's Alexis. Our music is done by Jason Lisko. Art is by Sarah Hodgkiss. I do the editing, and Alexis does our social media. And until next time,
See you next time.
Be me, you, and Jeju.
Thanks, everybody. Ciao.